Hello class, part 2 of the cost allocation where we will be looking at the actual step down method, which is a little bit different in that it understands that the service departments, same information as we had with part 1, but it understands that the service departments actually consume from each other as far as food services has square footage, so they use the services of building services, and building services actually consumes meals from food services. So this is one step in actually helping to understand that relationship. The third method of service allocation is the reciprocal method, which we don't do, but that actually brings this arrow going in both directions to where they present cost to each other. But for this one, we're only going to look at picking one service center which we think serves the other one better, and then we'll be allocating to that service department from the first service department as well as to the producing. So there is an additional step here. So basically S1 will allocate to the second service department as well as the three producing departments. And then the second step, maybe the second part of it is, not the second step, but the second part of it is the second servicing department with the costs of the first serving department included in their cost base will allocate those costs also out to the producing department. So let's look at the steps. Again, we have 9 million in total to allocate based on the 6 and the 3. And we have the allocation bases for the two departments, or the two service departments that are getting allocated out to the producing department. So for this one, we will pick food services being first. They're going to allocate out to the building services, intensive care, surgery, and general medicine. So the way you do that is you find the total quantity of allocation base. So what you need to do is you're picking up the allocation base for building services, intensive care, surgery, and general medicine. So we've got the 12,000, 3,000, 4,000, 98 gives us a total this time of 117, which becomes our denominator as far as doing the number 2, which is calculating the percentage. So again, it's very similar to the direct method after this as far as how it gets calculated out. So when we look at this formula here, we do see that building services, which has 12,000 meals, is 12,000 out of the 117, so that gives us 10%. And we do the same calculation for each as far as getting the percentage of consumption. And then we allocate the $3 million, which is what the food services cost, is a cost center. And then it shows how much of each of these gets picked up by. So building services actually picks up 307,000 of the food services costs. So now the trick to this is we have to remember, because the building services will actually get allocated out in the second part of this to the producing. So food services has allocated 307,000 to building services. So when we're actually allocating out building services 6 million, we need to add their 307,000 to it, and that gets allocated out to the producing departments. So again, for the first step, we figured out the total quantity, then we calculated the percentage, which is step 2, and then step 3 is allocate out to the service departments as well as allocate the cost of the service department, to the other receiving departments. And then we return to step 1, which is back up here, but just for the remaining service. So then we'll go down to building services because that's the one that's left. And we're just allocating building services out because food services has already been allocated to all that it needs to. So now we're just concentrating on building. So very similar to what we did in the direct, we're just picking up the 10,000, 20, and 40 as far as our total allocation base, which is 70,000 in total. Gets our percentages, and as I said, we're not doing the 6 million because we have to consider the 6 million plus the 307 that was allocated from food services, and that's the multiplication by the percentage of consumption, and this is what gets allocated to the cost. So when we do the total, as far as step 5 down here, is sum all the allocations for each of the producing departments to find out how much of the costs of these overhead departments or cost centers that each one is picking up. Building services, and this is actually in reverse, so you can bear with me, sorry. Okay, so food services actually only allocates 2.7 million to the producing departments because that other 300,000 is allocated to building services, and that's why building services allocation in total is 6.37 or 6.3 million down here. But if you look in total, only the 9 million was allocated to the producing departments. So that was the second part. That's a step-down method. And now, as I said, the reciprocal method understands that the building services actually services food services as well as food services servicing building services, and the reciprocal takes that relationship into account and does a better job with that, just a little bit more complicated. So that's the end of part 2.